In the last lecture, we found out that the euphoric celebration after World War II ended was relatively short-lived because although America emerged as a superpower, we weren't the only superpower to emerge out of World War II. We know that the Soviet Union had played an instrumental role in the defeat of the Germans and the European theater in World War II, and we also know that we were friends with the Soviets during that period. The problem is, in the aftermath of World War II, both the United States and the Soviet Union not only want to prevent wars like the previous one from happening ever again, they also want to they also want to stabilize the world in their own worldview. And what that means is the United States wants to sprinkle democracy throughout the rest of the world, Europe and elsewhere, and the Soviet Union wants to do this by spreading communism. So what we're going to see is the emergence of the Cold War, which is more or less where we left off the last time. And we had Harry Truman in the White House, and Truman demonstrated that he was a Cold Warrior when it comes to not allowing countries to be taken over by communism. We looked around and we saw the Soviet Union being led by a guy that, everything about him said dictator. We knew that he had crimes against humanity, and we knew that he had this tendency of quote-unquote liberating countries and then just never going back home. We saw that very clearly in the case of East Germany. So anyway, for all intents and purposes, this Cold War not only pits the United States against the Soviet Union in this international struggle for world dominance, it also looks an awful lot like the new coming of Hitler. Okay? This being the case, there's going to be a lot of Americans at home on a domestic level that feel that they need to address the issue of communism. We were talking about 1949 being a bad year for U.S. foreign policy makers. One of the reasons, maybe the reason it was so bad, was because in 1949 the Soviet Union had successfully detonated an atomic weapon, and that ended our nuclear monopoly when it comes to weapons of mass destruction. A lot of people explain this to themselves by telling themselves there must be American-born communists, people here at home that were more loyal to the Communist Party than they were to the United States, and they had given them these atomic secrets, these military secrets. We're not really going to get into that today. That'll be for another lecture, but for the time being, I need you to understand that anything that really related to socialism on any level became very suspicious. And as we've said in this class before, there were aspects of the New Deal that were very socialistic. As a matter of fact, there's something called the Social Security Act, and running this New Deal or expanding this New Deal in the aftermath of World War II became a very delicate balancing act. And poor Harry Truman is caught in the crossfire of all of this. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about Harry Truman and the world in which he inherits in the post-war period. Truman really was Franklin Roosevelt's protege when it comes to a New Deal Democrat. He was from Missouri, and one of the things that he believed deeply in is that government could be used as a force of good in American life, and that if it regulated the American economy in a way that provided security for everyone, it would actually enhance the standard of living for all parties involved. The problem, like any other post-war period, is we see a downturn in the economy. Okay, it's a transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. Markets are needing to adjust. Price, supply, and demand needs to adjust. The problem with this, though, is what it spells to the Henry Fords and the American Tobaccos and the Anheuser-Busches of the world is a downscaling in production, which means fewer and fewer workers working. Now, I told you that one of the things that comes out of World War II are more than 1 million dues-paying, card-carrying union members. And so after the war, we see a lot of labor strife, a lot of strikes, a lot of boycotts, a lot of workers disagreeing with their bosses. Now, you couple this with the idea that for more than 4 years, workers had abided by a no-strike pledge. They said, we in order to be patriotic Americans and keep our fighting men in bullets and uniforms and helmets and grenades and and the like, we're not going to walk off of our jobs. Working class America was very much ripe for some labor strife. They wanted raises. They wanted a slice of that post-war prosperity. From the outside looking in, though, this looks an awful lot like class conflict, or maybe put another way, there are people that are interpreting what they're seeing in 1945, 1946 as the same thing that happened in Russia in 1917 when the Communist Party came to power. So as you can see, there's kind of this obsession that's developing in Cold War America when it comes to how do we prevent the spread of communism, especially here at home in the United States. One of the things that happens in 1946 is a conservative Republican takeover of Congress. Keep in mind, Republicans, generally speaking, had been the minority party since Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932. This is an opportunity for the Republicans to kind of circle their wagons and regroup. And in 1947, basically at the behest of the House Republicans, what you see passed is something called the Taft-Hartley Act. Now, the Taft-Hartley Act was really designed to combat some of what a lot of Republican and some conservative Democrat politicians felt was class conflict. These politicians believed that labor unions had just too much power, and that power needed to be curbed to keep everything safe in the marketplace. Now, the Taft-Hartley Act does a lot of things, but what I really want you to understand is, at the most basic level, it gives rise to what you and I call the right to work state, okay? Maybe that's a politically correct statement. I guess maybe a better way of putting this would be an anti-union state, okay? Now, if you recall, in 1935, when the Wagner Act was passed, when workers sat down in the factories, they said, we're not leaving this factory until you give us the right of what the federal government says that we have a right to have. What Taft-Hartley does is it transfers that power, the federal government mandating unions if the employees choose to have a union, it transfers that power over to the state government. And so essentially it's telling Texas, it's telling Louisiana, Oklahoma, California, Nevada, Illinois, Michigan, if you don't agree with, the idea of workers forming unions, it's going to be at the state level that you can voice that opinion, okay? And so it's essentially having the state government replace the federal government when it comes to whether or not unionism is going to be permissible in whatever state that you're talking about, okay? Now, generally what you see, and certainly Taft-Hartley would be an example of this, generally what you see, though, is a push to the political right. We're becoming a more conservative country, at least for the time being we are. Now, in 1948, Harry Truman was up for re-election, well, really election, considering he had inherited the presidency. And every poll in America had him going down to Thomas Dewey. By some stretch of a political miracle, Harry Truman's able to win this thing, even though, if you're following along with me, you see that slide that's got Truman holding up the copy of the Chicago Daily Tribune that says that he had lost the election. He wins, but he wins by a very narrow margin. If you take that, you couple it with the fact that the Republicans are now running Congress, it's going to be difficult for him to get a lot accomplished in his time in the White House, okay? But for his part, Harry Truman really picked up where FDR left off when it comes to the New Deal. Provide more security for more Americans. Now, Truman's project to that end would be something called the Fair Deal. And I know at this point in the semester I kind of sound like a used car salesman. We've been talking about square deals, and new deals, and fair deals, and deals. But at any rate, the Fair Deal is Harry Truman's attempt to generally lift the standard of living in the United States. So to that end, what he wanted was a national health care program. There were millions of Americans that really didn't have great access to medical care. Truman wanted to change that by providing a government-ran, state-ran health insurance program. Now, we know what happened to things like the Shepard-Towner Act. We know what happens, generally speaking, in the aftermath of the 1940s, 1950s, when we proposed government-ran healthcare. Critics called it socialized medicine, and in a day and age where to call something or someone a socialist pretty much was akin to calling somebody in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692 a witch, it shred it of any kind of credibility whatsoever. So Truman doesn't get a national health care program. So he turned his attention to improving American education, and he really didn't have a whole lot of success with that either. As a matter of fact, the fair deal, generally speaking, is considered a failure. It's really considered something that Harry Truman was not able to get accomplished. The one silver lining would be civil rights, okay? Now, I don't know if you remember me talking about executive orders and the War Powers Act in 1941. We've seen that this has the power to do great good in American democracy, but at the same time great harm. So an example of great harm would be Japanese internment through Executive Order 9066. But with one stroke of the pen, what Harry Truman does is he issues an executive order that integrates the military. Now, this is very important. It might not sound like much to you, considering we've grown up with an integrated military, that the best man or woman for the job gets that job. And if anything, the military has become more small d democratic now in the 21st century, that gays and lesbians can serve not only in the military, but openly in the military. But back even as late as World War II, it was illegal for a medic to take blood from an African American soldier and give it to a white soldier in a blood transfusion, even if that meant saving that other soldier's life. Okay? So Harry Truman integrating the military is a really big deal, and it's a step in the direction of the government taking the lead when it comes to enforcing civil rights. Now, granted, it's a small step, but it's a step nonetheless, considering how much of a cornerstone the military is in modern American life. Okay. Now, with respect to foreign policy, Truman very much was a Cold Warrior. We know that Harry Truman was no joke when it comes to issuing a warning to the Soviets, look, leave Greece and Turkey alone, or there will be consequences for this. A vivid example of Truman's commitment to containing communism comes to us in East Asia in what would later become known as the Korean War. Now, after World War II, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. Everybody north of that parallel line was a communist country in North Korea. Everybody to the south, South Korea, was allied with the Allied forces during World War II, and they were a small d Democratic Party. Well, in 1950, communist Korean forces began pouring down the peninsula, and they not only pushed the Koreans, the South Koreans, almost completely out of the country, they pushed those Allied forces out as well. Harry Truman sends troops, he sends basically the U.S. military over there, and the military not only pushed their way all the way back to the 38th line, they pushed them up to the northern Korean border with China. Now think about what happened to China in 1949. It went through a communist revolution. And so you've got this newly established communist regime, and right to their south you're seeing all of this strife that's erupting, and it's going on between one of your, maybe not sworn enemies, but people that are certainly not exactly warm to your political views, to your worldview. So what I want you to understand here is when the American forces begin threatening what China feels is their newly established government, China intervenes. Okay? Now, the Chinese military really was not exactly a superpower military from a technological standpoint, from an organizational standpoint, but what it had a lot of was infantrymen, millions and millions and millions of people, and you really couldn't defeat it. I mean, I guess you could bomb them back to the Stone Age, which some people wanted to do, saw that as a missed opportunity to reestablish a democratic China, but another story for another class. but you really couldn't defeat the Chinese military. It fought fiercely, and it fought well, and it was so huge that it it would have taken at the very least another World War II like commitment to quote unquote winning the Korean War and defeating Red China in the process if we were going to do that. Ultimately, when the Chinese come down, uh, they send human waves down the peninsula, and again, it almost pushes the U.S. forces completely out of the peninsula. Harry Truman intensifies the fighting, and the long and short of it is, when they make their way back to the 38th parallel, Truman proposes a truce. It's not really going to be Truman that gets us out of Korea. It's going to be the next president, Dwight Eisenhower. But I need you to understand that there was a psychological toll associated with the Korean War. It ended very indecisively, okay? Not only was this fought basically to a draw, which had never happened in American military history before, um, this wasn't exactly Germany, Japan, or the Soviet Union that had done this. This is what a lot of Americans considered to be a developing world nation, and a lot of Americans thought that we had gotten pushed around. So the psychological impact of the Korean War was it really made a lot of Americans feel vulnerable when it comes to this issue of the Cold War. Here we see the expansion, or at least the perceived expansion, of communism. And not only did we go to war to prevent that expansion, but we didn't fight that war to a conclusive end. So, as you might imagine, this is going to have a very significant impact on American domestic politics at home. But for the time being, I'd like to focus the last few minutes of our lecture on Dwight Eisenhower and modern republicanism. Okay. In 1952, Harry Truman had more or less served 2 full terms as president. Right, he inherited FDR's presidency in 1945, shortly after Roosevelt was re-inaugurated for the 4th time, and by 1952, he pretty much felt confident that he had done as much as he could do with respect to being the president. So he indicates that he would not be running for re-election in 1952. And so the next guy that the Democrats have in line would be the military hero of the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was worth his weight in political gold, so to speak, and here's the reason why. Eisenhower, in addition to being a military hero and beloved by all Americans, whether they were Democrats or Republicans, he didn't have a political past. What I mean by that is he wasn't a Republican and he wasn't a Democrat. He was a military chief, and he felt to do his job effectively, he could not bring partisanship into the decisions that he made as a commander that were being handed down, his orders being handed down from politicians. He needed to follow them objectively. And so you couldn't really negatively campaign against this guy. He didn't have anything to hide when it comes to his political past, because there wasn't a political past. So anyway, ultimately, both the Democrats and the Republicans desperately want Dwight Eisenhower as their candidate in 1952. For his part, Eisenhower considered himself to be a limited government kind of guy, and therefore accepted the candidacy of the Republican Party. The guy that's going to be the Democratic candidate is a guy from Illinois, Adlai Stevenson, who is soundly defeated by Dwight Eisenhower in 1952, who's running on the platform of modern republicanism. Okay? I need you to understand something. We're not talking about a 21st century Republican in the sense that he's a very conservative, I guess there should be an asterisk next to that too, but a very conservative Republican. What modern republicanism really meant was we're not going to take apart the New Deal, the core of the New Deal, wholeheartedly. We're not going to destroy it. What we're going to do is modernize it. Or maybe looked at another way, this was a Republican spin on the New Deal. We're going to get rid of some of those archaic, obsolete programs that were designed to help the economy in the 1930s. After all, it is the 1950s now. But we're going to keep all of those things that have served the United States quite well when it comes to providing security. Okay? As a matter of fact, a lot of historians, myself included, consider Dwight Eisenhower's presidency to be the hidden hand presidency. In other words, from the surface level, it doesn't really look like he's very active. It doesn't look like he's Franklin Roosevelt when it comes to promoting legislation, demanding legislation. But behind the scenes, it's Eisenhower that's really pulling the strings, okay? Now, why? Well, on the most basic of levels, if you are going to contain communism, and Dwight Eisenhower made it his mission in life to make sure that not one more foot of land goes over to communism on his watch, that's going to require a very active federal government, okay? So it might not have been as overt as Franklin Roosevelt, but quietly and a lot of times behind the scenes, you have Dwight Eisenhower playing a very important role when it comes to producing measures that are specifically designed to curb the appeal and limit the ability of the spread of communism, including an international organization called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, okay? Now, NATO consisted of a lot of northern European countries. West Germany was a part, most of Scandinavia was a part, Britain, France were a part of it. And what this is saying to the Soviet Union is not only are these countries, including the United States, in a formal alliance, if you attack, if you invade one, understand that this is going to be considered an attack on all. In other words, we are not going to sit back like the British and the French did before World War II broke out and watch somebody like Hitler take over country after country after country. We're going to be proactive when it comes to nipping the problem in the bud, okay? Now, speaking of military readiness, one of the other things that Dwight Eisenhower wanted to rectify was the maneuverability of the American military. I mean, we had this massive country, and most people got around this country using highways like Route 66, just a two-lane highway. Now, that's not a bad way to get around, but it's certainly not the most effective way. And if you think about it, my guess is some of you, maybe even all of you, take some kind of expressway system to get from where you live to where you work, or at least you use an expressway system at the very least once a week. You wouldn't be able to do this if it weren't for the Interstate Highway and Defense Act of 1956. This is Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, that is not only commissioning a really big public works project. It's a public workers, American construction workers that are going to be paid by the federal government to construct this highway system. It is clearly an expansion of government. Okay. Now, why is he doing this? Well, he's doing it for the same reason that Hitler was trying to develop the Autobahn in Germany before and during World War II. This highway system in Germany not only linked every corner of the country together, but it allowed the German military to move nimbly. Eisenhower wanted something similar in that, and so these massive highways that we drive on a week-by-week basis, they're the product of the Dwight Eisenhower presidency, and they were basically designed to keep us ready if World War III ever broke out. Some of you may know the name Sputnik, right? Sputnik was a Russian rocket or satellite, however you want to look at it, that was launched into outer space. It was the first one to do so. Now, this was quite concerning to the United States, considering for a moment, if they can send a rocket into outer space, what's to say that they can't aim a rocket at the West, attach a nuclear bomb to it, push a button, and a few hours later, New York blows up. So the point that I want to make in this is that in order to keep up with the Soviet Union, what you're going to see Dwight Eisenhower do is really establish NASA, the National Aeronautics Space Administration. In 1958, we see the United States and the Soviet Union enter into the space race, and this is going to continue into Jack Kennedy's presidency in 1960, when, well, really 61, when Kennedy kind of committed the United States and NASA in particular to landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade. But this space race, basically the way that I like to think of it is, if you're going to beat the Soviets, you got to make sure that our nerds are better than their nerds. We needed smarter nerds. And so my guess is there's a few of you that are watching this that have taken an advanced placement, an AP course, And my guess is you probably took that so that you could earn college credit while you were still in high school. That's not what advanced placement was designed to do. Advanced placement was designed to pick up the best and the brightest American minds and put them in accelerated courses to really, be able to train them better, to pick out those kids that were going to be standout students at a very early age, and not only challenge them from an academic setting, but really kind of immerse them in a culture that consisted of other very bright boys and girls that could one day be their colleagues in research. So in 1958, what Eisenhower does is he establishes the STEM program, STEM, STEM. Still exists today. Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. If we were going to win this space race, those were the fields of academic study that were really going to push us over the top. So my point in telling you all of these things that the Eisenhower administration was responsible in doing is that containing communism meant that you had to be a very active president. You couldn't just sit on your hands. You had to be able to make sure that the American military had the resources that it needed. And a lot of times that included science and technology. Speaking of containing the spread of communism, it's during the Eisenhower administration that we're going to see communism threatening another Asian country, this time in Vietnam. The Communist Party of Vietnam is going to become the nationalist party that is going to promise freedom for that country. Now, the guy that's leading it is a man by the name of Ho Chi Minh, who is a communist. He helped to actually establish the Communist Party of Vietnam. But from the perspective of the Vietnamese rice farmer, he's a populist, right? He's like a Franklin Roosevelt to them in the sense that he's saying, look, there's good guys and bad guys. I'm a good guy, and if you get behind me, I'll help kick out the bad guys. And the bad guys would be the French colonists who have been there ever since 1858, sucking out all the wealth at the expense of everybody else, including that rice farmer. And so what Dwight Eisenhower does not want to happen is a democratic process that essentially elects a guy like Ho Chi Minh. Because what Ho Chi Minh is going to establish is not only a Vietnamese regime, he's going to establish a communist Vietnamese regime. And Eisenhower, like Truman before him, is a staunch Cold Warrior. This is not going to happen, not on my watch. And so as we get closer to what's happening in Southeast Asia, you're going to find out that America is going to become very involved in regime building, this whole process, in Vietnam, and it's going to trace its roots back to the Eisenhower administration. Okay, this will become clearer as we talk about the Vietnam War right now, but I wanted to mention this simply because the conflict that is Vietnam is going to span the course of several presidencies. It's going to start with Dwight Eisenhower. It's really not going to end until Nixon and later Ford in the mid-1970s. Okay, but here we are talking about it as early as the 1950s. That's where we're going to end our discussion today on Cold War America. When I meet with you again, we're going to be talking about the emergence of a second Red Scare, which, as I've already alluded to, has everything to do with this intense fear of communism in the United States, within the United States. When the Soviet Union built that bomb, a lot of people said the only way that they could do this is if they had American-born communists that sold out their home government. And so we're going to see this obsession emerge in American politics and American culture, really, that's going to emphasize control and going to emphasize the policing of political affiliation. So that's where we'll pick it up the next time I see you.